me to introduce Bradford Cross today, which will have a speech. Please speak up also. I see some faces which maybe some of us know me. I'm running or I'm organizing events for IT community here, and one of the key idea of this effort is to make this region more visible and attractive for companies and investors which do like game-changing things, projects and so on. And I'm glad that finally there is some company which, or this company, Bradford and his team, is one of bright examples of this kind of companies, and we are kind of glad that maybe also our community helped to make this city attractive for them. So Bradford will also speak today about how these distributed teams works in a global scale, and let's just listen. Welcome, Bradford Cross again.
Who's slide turning? Is that you? Are you on slide? Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. All right. So this talk is going to be about a lot of experiences that we've had in the past 2 or 3 years building our startup studio. For those of you who don't know, just like very quickly what it is, we have an entity which builds startups. We generate the ideas. We have a whole special process for this, and then we go and build these companies and hopefully get them to really work and spin them out. But we don't really play around with ideas and sort of dabble and have like a lab or something like this. We actually have a fairly rigorous process for how we select what we want to do, and we invest capital like a normal venture capitalist would into the startup from the very beginning. So it's really like a startup production machine. And so far we've built 4 companies in the past 2 years. And we're continuing to grow, looking to do about another 4 companies this year. And we've operated out of San Francisco, New York, and 4 cities here in Central Europe: Prague, Bratislava, Brno, and here in Košice. And this is really just kind of sharing some of the experiences of the nasty stuff that happens in the real world when you take sort of this R&D type, quick iterative, let's get our first customer approach, and then smash it up against like very important, hard, gnarly enterprise problems that have to go into production right away because you've just gotten a customer. And so this is the kind of a chaos and misery that pretty much all startups go through, in particular until folks get a lot of different experience with the very complicated stuff in the outside world, dealing with clients and managing that kind of stuff, which I think people come to learn is actually massively harder than the building of the technology stuff. This is in fact what drove me to choose to become a CEO instead of continuing to be like a technology-oriented co-founder, was because I came to realize that this stuff is actually vastly harder than everything else, and I could create most space for the team by going to do this stuff, which is definitely not the most fun work in a lot of ways, but it's very rewarding because of the impact that it yields. So, okay, that's my intro. Let's go ahead. So, everyone has fun when they're kind of cruising and iterating fast and working with their team internally. Maybe you have one little like test user or something like that, right? And everybody's having fun and you're iterating super quickly, right? Go ahead to the next slide. And then when it comes into the outside world, meaning like you have many customers or you have many different users and you're getting feedback from them, and now you need to somehow prioritize this, and people disagree and stuff, and it's no longer just this one little focus group with the one test user and kind of quickly iterating, but it gets vastly more complicated. And then you also have production issues because now you're not managing some sort of a prototype thing that you were using to try to get a customer, but you're actually managing something in production. And depending on how complex the system is, this might be really a huge endeavor. All right. So we're going to break it down into 3 sections. I got sales. We're going to talk about sales and going to market a little bit. I got clients, and we'll talk about managing clients, in engineering and business people that are engaging with clients on a full-time basis. And then we'll talk about engineering at the end and all the different kind of engineering client-facing activities. I figured there would probably be a number of technical folks, so I tried to go into detail on that section and try to be maximally helpful and concrete about the recommendations. All right, so when you're selling a product for the first time, like you hopefully you're coming in with a clear vision and strategy in what you're trying to do. And in the end, you want to have a concrete product that multiple people want to buy, that you can repeatedly sell, right? And the only way to really, kind of steer and navigate is by getting feedback, from the marketplace. And a huge amount of that comes in meetings, in like sales meetings and stuff. So basically, whoever is going to be kind of, driving product, trying to navigate towards product market fit, basically has to be the lead salesperson. And there's no way to really like offload that. So if you want to be engaged in that kind of activity, which I think is probably the core of what many people would consider to be like entrepreneurship, then you definitely have to be willing to be the primary sales leader. If not, you should give up on your dreams, because it's not going to work. Because you've got to like be the one who's talking to the customer and getting the feedback, because that's how you steer, right? Second thing is demand test hacks is like a really important thing that you should think about a lot, because you don't want to do lots of work and then nobody wanted the thing that you've built, right? You want to try to do experiments that are really quick and cheap and prove to you that you should build this thing. So it might be, I'm going to force somebody to close a POC contract with me, and I'm only going to have a prototype until they close it. Once it closes, then I'm going to go and build like a production ready thing. Not going to build out giant speculative infrastructure when a deal is in progress, because it might blow up, right? I might do something like, if a customer is willing to share data with me before I have an NDA in place, because they're so desperate to solve this problem that they just want to get me started, that's a huge sign of demand, right? If paperwork turns go very quickly, that's a huge sign of demand, because usually when you're dealing with lawyers and stuff, everything drags out forever, right? We all know that. So if those guys are going quick, that's when you know that this is a serious deal, that somebody's putting pressure on them, because lawyers definitely don't move quick because they want to, right? So the strategic selling playbook, this is basically like closing initial deals is much harder than repeatable sales, like where you're just dropping in a salesperson, right? The very first sort of deal, it really needs to be very strategic. So like if you're leading the whole company or leading the whole product, like that's why you're the one selling. You're the one who the customers want to engage with when you're very first doing something, right? Because the product doesn't even exist yet, or it partially exists. So they're basically trusting you, right? They're not trusting your product, they're actually trusting you. So it's very strategic and it's very deeply people-oriented. You spend a lot of time thinking about all the different stakeholders involved in really building their trust, because again, they're betting on you, not betting on the product, actually. Early stage customer is actually just like an early stage VC, right? So like the good ones are smart enough to bet on the person, not the product, because they know that the person's just making the product, and the product is probably crappy because it's like, 2 months old or something. So the last thing is closing as a craft. This is super important. Like, deals blow up. It's very hard to get deals actually closed. Lots of people will talk and talk and talk. And to run a rigorous sales process, we'll talk about in a minute, is very important. But the closing itself is also a craft, and you can't really overinvest in learning how to close deals and understand whether or not something is actually going to close versus if it's just this conversation that's dragging out and it's not actually a deal. All right, go ahead. So trusting the process. I think one of the lessons over time has been that sales ops is really the foundation of everything. So if you guys don't know how building sales functions works, it's sales ops role is basically running, the sales force and the pipeline and all this type of stuff. And there's different kinds of functions that are built up around this, like BDR or SEO, like sales kind of representatives that can do some maybe prospecting calls, for example, and they reach out and they work on marketing materials together with the marketing team. So they're not just doing pure ops like project management work to move the deals forward, but rather also working on content and maybe doing some upfront prospecting. And they may grow into field salespeople in the future. So we built this kind of function that we really like that's like a little bit of a turbocharged sales ops function. And it works really, really well. Once that's been in place, all of the startups continue to make like really rock solid progress on their commercial pipelines. So I think sometimes you'll bet on like the salesperson first instead of the process, and that's a very big mistake actually that we've learned. You don't want to do that. You want to bet on the process. And again, the primary leader of the thing, which in this case has been me, needs to go out and sell. And then as the thing gets going in a certain direction, then many other people can start to participate in this, but it's the core team, it's the product and the engineering team that are really driving that initiative. And again, like once the process is in place, you can add and remove people. Like if you have somebody that's not working out and they're blowing up accounts, you can transition them out. It's not that big of a deal if they own a bunch of other accounts because you have a repeatable process and everything is well known, so you can transfer it to somebody else. Just like you would on an engineering team, right? This is why you have these types of practices on an engineering team. And basically you should think about a sales pipeline in sort of three chunks. You've got the top, the middle, and the end. And at the top, you just want to make sure that stuff's always coming in so that it doesn't just get dry and stale. And then in the middle, you want to make sure things are moving forward, and there's lots of different processes for kind of qualifying deals or trying to disqualify them. You don't want stuff being stuck in there, right? You don't want to spend a lot of time spinning your wheels on something that's not actually a deal. And then at the end of the process, you kind of again have this whole closing, craft of closing thing, and there's quite a lot of work and intensity that needs to go into closing the deals in the end. All this stuff is kind of part of getting the basic sales process in place, and I think this is the key. If you do this, you're going to be much more likely to be successful. If you just start to go out and start selling or try to find somebody to sell, then it's much less likely to be successful. Okay. Product, market, and salesperson fit. So you've all heard of like product market fit. What is product market salesperson fit? So depending on what you're trying to sell and to whom, different people should be doing the selling, right? So one thing that we've learned, we build these vertical AI companies which are quite complicated, and the technology is kind of deep and complex sometimes, and you're explaining it to a subject matter expert who probably isn't very technical. Meanwhile, the technologists also have to get deep into the subject matter expertise because these domains are kind of gnarly, so you need to you get yourself quite comfortable and conversant with the domain. And so I think in that kind of a setting where it's very complicated in terms of both the tech and the domain, it's going to inform you towards a more sophisticated salesperson, right? So with this particular company that we have, Merlin, that does anti-money laundering software for big banks, the deal sizes are very large. They're in the millions. Like all the two first things that we've done have been in the territory of like $4 or $5 million. So they're pretty big deals. And the bank wants to work with somebody fairly sophisticated and senior that kind of understands what's going on. It's a big turnoff for them if you put somebody that's not that savvy and it's just sort of a slicked back hair kind of sales guy in front of them who doesn't understand what's going on. We've seen very negative reactions. So I think you got to be careful about the profile depending on the type of product and the customer that you're selling to. And then of course, there's just kind of scale as well, right? Where like, if you're doing these huge multi-million-dollar deals with really big companies, that's a very different thing than if you have like regional salespeople that are selling to medium-sized businesses. So you need to spend a lot of time to think carefully, like what are you selling and to whom, and how does that inform the profile of the salesperson that you want? It's very nuanced. It's not a thing where you want like a one size fits all. Even in the same size market, it's very different profiles. Okay, so. Prototyping ahead, like I said earlier, you don't want to build stuff people don't want. That's obvious. But I think that prototypes are actually better than slides for sales materials in many cases, for winning people over. I always like to do a live demo of a clickable prototype rather than a slide deck if I can. I've usually always used that as my primary initial sales tool, actually, for the first couple of years of a startup. But I think when you're doing these, you kind of need to time box them, and that's like you're saying, here's the amount I'm willing to bet on this before a customer will bet with me, right? I'm willing to put down a bet, which is my prototype, but now somebody out there in the customer landscape needs to put down a bet, which is that they need to do a deal with me and show that they've validated that prototype is actually meeting their needs. Otherwise, I'm not going to keep on building stuff because I don't know if anyone wants it, right? So I only build production when I have a validated deal. All right. So basically, in the beginning, your network is really your platform. Again, it's all people-oriented. Like they're trusting you; they're not trusting your product. You are getting to people through your network. You don't even have a sales process set up yet, so you're not like marketing and stuff. It's very people-based. So you use a lot of networking-based like tools and hacks and whatnot. So anyone who wants to like deal with the outside world and start getting into sales, definitely invest heavily in like actually pay attention to social media and make sure that you really build a big network, because that's actually the way that you kind of like start to harvest and get leads and get referrals to new deals. Obviously this thought leadership thing is the worst term ever, but it's kind of important because it's like if you are actually really knowing what you're talking about so much that people are willing to like listen to you and learn from you, then this obviously puts you in a position of authority when you're talking about your product and you're selling. So it's very important to not just dump out crappy marketing stuff that just says awesome things about your product, which may or may not be true, but to actually demonstrate your capability through sharing knowledge that shows people directly, wow, these guys really know what they're talking about, they have serious knowledge. Vertical communities, this is like really important because you might have a product where you're not in that vertical. Like I mentioned, we're doing this anti-money laundering thing, and we didn't start with a deep banking network. We definitely didn't start with a deep compliance network, but we gradually hired people on the team that had that. We brought in investors that had that. We brought in advisors that had that and gave them little chunks of the company. And so we were able to really bootstrap ourselves into this vertical community so that we now have like a presence within this kind of anti-money laundering and financial crime community. And we have a big bank network. We know all the big bank VCs and stuff. And so, you know, you need to have a playbook for building that out if you're not going to only work in areas that you've already worked in the past. And then, again, like the repeatable process thing is very important also from a marketing perspective, because if your sales process stuff isn't in good shape, you shouldn't market. This is a mistake a lot of people make. They do launches, they do marketing stuff. They don't understand that you don't have your funnel sorted, so you're dumping leads into a broken funnel. Like you have no idea how your funnel is performing. Why would I possibly start to go out and launch my company and try to promote it and everything else? What if I get if I get lucky and some piece of content goes viral or something, and suddenly I send a bunch of people through a broken funnel? I just lost my chance with a ton of customers, and that was really a bad outcome. Okay, go ahead. So, see, anything else I want to say about this? I think I kind of covered it on the last. I guess the only other thing I'll say about this, it's also nice because you can follow like this kind of stepwise kind of process where you first make it repeatable, and then you say, okay, great, what in the course of doing that, I built this awesome network that's been like referring me to all these deals, and I also have tons of customers or potential customers, loads of contacts now in my CRM, my Salesforce or whatever. And so now is a good time to start to leverage that same ecosystem for promoting stuff. For example, like if I write now an essay about the topic my company works on, I can ask those guys to review my essay, and then they'll feel buy-in and excitement about it, and then later I can ask those same experts to now share my essay. So now I've like kind of harvested my sales pipeline and my initial community that I built within the vertical. I've effectively now harvested as my core for my marketing engine. So this is the next step. And then lastly, you just start, you can do all kinds of different campaigns from there. I've shared a trivial example of kind of a social kind of sharing campaign around a blog post. Okay. Clients. So let me see what I'm doing on time here. Cool, awesome. Clients, all right. Go ahead. So, once you have real clients, you probably want some kind of full-time client engagement people. Obviously, it's going to be dependent on the scale of like how many clients you have or whatever. And I'm a very big believer that the earlier you are, the more you want the core product and engineering team servicing all the clients, doing all their own QA, maintaining their own stuff in prod, because that sense of ownership and rotation of that stuff keeps the team very connected with the realities of the customer. And I think if you disconnect it at an early stage, it tends to go very badly off the rails. So I think, again, like with sales, when you come to client management, you want like specific profiles. So like if you have a huge enterprise deployment or integration, then you want somebody who's comfortable with that and will go and travel around to different cities around the world and be embedded in client sites for a while and so on. If you have SMB company, like you have a SaaS company, and it's like really long tail SaaS, meaning it's like really small deals and huge volume, like huge number of customers, then you need a totally different kind of a person who's going to be much more tools based and systems based, and how do I take this massive amount of feedback and kind of make sense of it somehow. It's radically different profiles, obviously. Forward deployed engineers and forward deployed subject matter experts. The forward deployed engineer thing is like a made up term by Palantir. I kind of like it, so I sometimes use it. I think many people do. Basically, the idea is it's just sort of like a embedded or client facing engineer who could be building stuff or working with a client in the field in some way. And I think this is really important. I think we've definitely made the mistake of not doing that right much earlier. Like I wish we would have thought that through and done it right earlier, like rotated it correctly earlier and then gotten a full-time dedicated person in earlier for the one of our companies that I keep mentioning that does the money laundering stuff, because it's very complicated, these engagements we have with the big banks, and it really does need somebody full-time to deal with how gnarly it is. And I think sometimes you need the same with subject matter experts as well. Like for example, we have another thing in healthcare, which is doing clinical trials. And once this thing gets going, you have all these trials running, you need these like clinical operations people and whatnot. Those are effectively forward deployed subject matter experts that are out in the field running studies. Maybe they're working with a pharma partner or a hospital site or something. Okay. This is a huge one. This is one I'll admit that I think I only learned this very recently when I was reflecting on some mistakes that I had made in the past couple of years. And I think sometimes, there's such a mantra of growth and startups and growth at all costs, and you push, and you set these crazy targets, and I think you can tend to over-focus on those targets and then not focus enough on making your initial customers happy. And where this is especially flawed reasoning, it should be obvious, because I was just walking you through this stuff where I'm touting the benefits of this whole community-oriented marketing stuff, and like, now the guys who are supposed to do the word of mouth like hate you, right? So you just like wreck the whole thing, right? So ultimately, like over-investing, really making your first customers love you is so important. Like if you can't, keeping also getting new customers in and you don't retain them is also worthless, right? You need to retain them, or else you're not actually growing. So signing people up, is something which is a scalar on retention, and if retention is like 0, then guess what? Your growth is actually 0. Even though it may look temporarily like you're signing people up, your growth is 0 in the long run. So you have to like make these people happy, you have to keep them so you're not churning your early customers, and ultimately you want them to be the primary force for your marketing. So I've come to view things very differently now, where now I think of like, push super hard, get to your early customers, and then really shift the attention to showing the love and executing super well on those first customers, and then kind of craft a campaign about how that's being shared out and leveraged to do the second big wave. Okay, services versus product. So this is real important. A lot of people miss this. I missed this also at the beginning of this Merlon company that we keep going into here. So the thing is, you have people which are used to working on projects in such a way where they don't actually set any direction. They just take direction and they execute. And this is works very poorly when you start applying this in a product company, because you just start hacking all kinds of stuff in all the time, and you're never really driving towards a strategy. And then the worst thing that happens, right, is that people hire services companies because they think at least that they know what they want to do and they just want to execute it. People hire product companies because they know what the problem is and they just want a solution to the problem, right? So they've hired you because they want you to solve their problem. So if you start acting like a services company, then you're really not doing what they've hired you to do.
right? And so what'll happen is they'll be telling you stuff, but they've already put their hand up and said, I want to hire a product company, I want somebody to solve my problem. So if you just start building whatever they say or ask or whatnot, now they're probably not going to tell you the right stuff to do. So you're going to build something that's not even going to meet their needs. So the worst thing that happens is you end up acting like a consulting company. You build a whole bunch of stuff that people tell you that they need or they want or whatever, and then in the end, you are the one who looks like an idiot who has a solution that doesn't meet their needs, and the customer is definitely going to point at you and say, I hired you to solve my problem. You haven't solved my problem. And then you're going to be like, but I built all the stuff you told me to build. They said, but you're not a consultant, I hired a product company. This is a huge thing that so many people miss. Okay, next. And that's also a reactive versus a proactive mode, right? So a services mode is, you know, the customers come into me, they have the project planned out and so on, and they kind of steer it, right? And a product model is more like, I have a vision, I want to see if it meets people's needs, I'm going to test my hypotheses, but I'm always coming out and poking the market and looking for a reaction and feedback. I'm not waiting for the market to come to me, tell me anything. Go ahead. So this is also really important, again, if you have an enterprise, so you're meaning big deals, long rollouts, complicated things, you've got to have a spreadsheet or roadmap specific to each client. So what we do is basically just imagine a simple spreadsheet. Release dates are rows. Okay. Release dates are rows, and then the columns are bugs, features, models, you know, whatever. It could be other activities like education and training, for example. Like if you have a complex system and there's user training required, that would go on the roadmap. And this is how you avoid these real nasty blowups that happen when you haven't thought through dependencies properly. And this is what this is all about. It happens all the time. You know, just like the NER thing that we're debugging right now, right? It's like, you do a thing, and in a complex setting like this, there's so many downstream dependencies. Like, how are you going to test this? How are you going to eval this? How are you going to explain it to the customer? Does there need to be educational materials because the customer needs to explain it to their users? It's very complex. And so you want to make sure that you know if you're going to ship something into prod, all the stuff that has to happen before that, and the stuff that also has to happen right after. And you really want to go into super meticulous detail so that you're not missing anything. Because it's very common that you miss a dependency of something that's going to take a long time, or you don't think through some kind of testing or evaluation that needs to happen, or you miss some sort of perf testing that needs to happen, and it ends up showing its ugly head in prod, which, as we all know, is not where you want to find this kind of stuff. All right. Don't make your customer do your QA. This is a common practice at consumer companies. Actually, if you talk to many JavaScript guys that lead big JavaScript projects, even at companies like Google, Twitter, Facebook, etc., they sort of have a like run fast and lean mode where they'll put stuff out very quickly. And of course, they have lots of automated tests and whatnot, but they tend to not really do much manual QA. And they do actually have, obviously nobody will announce this publicly or something, but they do actually have kind of a semi-latent, unstated policy of like letting the users kind of test the stuff and find some of these bugs. And the reason why that can work for them, actually, I don't actually cast aspersions on this approach. I think it's fine. The reason it can work for them is because they can re-roll everything out so fast. So if you're pushing, you know, multiple versions of your website to production every day, then it's actually okay if you have some of these smaller bugs and then you just quickly catch on the next loop. So that process works. Some you know, other settings, it doesn't really work anymore, right? And like if in this complex type of an enterprise setting like we're talking about, you can't really do that. So instead you have to be very careful. You have to acceptance scenarios. You probably want to share these with the client so they can, you know, verify that the scenarios work on their side too. You might have different environments, so you might have different environments in different jurisdictions or regions around the world, or you might have like an on-prem instance and a cloud instance and all this crap. So you want to be able to all verify in sync on your side and on the client side that stuff works as you expect across those different environments. And I think, again, like I say everyone QAs, right, in the beginning. Like, I don't believe in hiring QAs. Like, it will force automation, it will make the engineers really grumpy, and it will build a good engineering culture. And if you try to start hiring QAs early, this is exactly the road to a terrible engineering culture that doesn't take quality seriously at all. Designing serious, like, kind of systems for complex testing, this is a big deal. Again, like, if you have a gnarly machine learning kind of engine going on, like we oftentimes do, you're maybe deploying it somewhere, maybe even in some different environment that's in somebody else's firewall, and you have limited visibility to it and stuff. You kind of need to invest a lot into the testing harnesses of these things. You know, perf testing, like accuracy testing, all kinds of different testing, and scrutinizing it manually, and, you know, don't trust your the normal process you're following. Like, change the testing process every so often, just so that you're testing it in a fresh way and you're not, like, counterintuitively, you know, overfitting or missing some systemic problem. You really should be like a scientist trying to sort of falsify your hypothesis and constantly, like, building these different systems to try to test your stuff in different ways and try to really try to break it. The more complex it is, you know, the worse it is. When something happens in production, you have to try to debug it in production. So it's like, it's better to kind of pull the cost up front and overinvest up front. All right, cool. Engineering is the last section I'm going to talk about. So there's a pretty binary switch, and I think people oftentimes miss it when you've gone through sort of a prototype or a proof of concept stage and you get excited about a new deal and you start to really build it out. You will oftentimes really miss that you've shifted to this different mode now and you're really working on a production system now. And I think you should really flip the switch, like, in a pretty binary fashion when you go from something that you're saying is one of these bets to see if anyone wants this product, versus when you know somebody wants it and now you're trying to deliver customer happiness, so much so that they'll refer you to other customers. Then you need to, like, radically change your mindset at that point. And I think this is something that is sometimes tricky to do. I'm even starting to think about doing stuff like maybe that's when you go for, like, a trip to the mountains or something as a team and, like, do the strategy for the next 6 months or something like that to try to, like, pull them out of the context and really, like, reset it. This is really serious because it's two very different modes of execution. Okay, go ahead. I'm a big fan, so what we're going to talk about a lot in here is, like, what I call kind of systems of ownership or systems of responsibility in engineering, and I'm a big fan of designing these and kind of rotating responsibilities as a way to really build a great culture of shared ownership among the team, spreading context and so on. So I'm just going to share some different tips for how I like to build these different rotation systems. At the early stage companies, I think everybody rotates all the core responsibilities for the most part. Not a believer in separating a lot of these things out. So go ahead. So how do you rotate them? One, not organically. So code review is a great example. Engineering teams oftentimes like, yeah, we do code reviews. What's the code review process? We have this style guide, and then I, like, send it out to people who I think, like, knows this part of the code or whatever. It's kind of random, and it's supposed to happen organically. This is really bad, I think. I usually see this create a lot of bottlenecks, like maybe only one girl knows this part of the code, and so all the PRs go to her for that, and then everybody, you know, if somebody's all working on that in 1 month, then she just gets killed and can't do anything but code reviews. Or, you know, people will get really frustrated because of how long code reviews are taking, and they'll start doing other weird things and tricks to kind of get around the process, instead of realizing that in reality you just need everybody to be able to code review, and you need everybody to have more context of the overall system so that you have high throughput in the code reviews and you can have a solid SLA and quick turnaround time. So I'm a believer in the round robin and approval matrix. What this means is, like, it's just a trivial round robin always going around the team for these responsibilities. And there's a process in approval matrix, which means, like, let's say a new junior person comes in from university Of course, they don't just start to become, just start reviewing people's code, right? Because anytime somebody wants to do a dirty hack, they're going to just send it to this guy so that he can we'll just rubber stamp it or whatever. So you can't do that. You of course have to train them. So they first shadow somebody else that's code reviewing, and then you can. I really believe in like making this explicit. Like maybe they have to do 2 or 3 shadowings, and then maybe they have to do 3 reviews where somebody else more senior is shadowing them. And then maybe after that, you let them review, but then you review their reviews. So you do like a meta review every 2 weeks, and once after they do that for 2 months, then you're signed off, right? Whatever, that's just one example, but define an actual process and just roll it out. And there should always be like a first line, that's the entire team, and like a second line that's like a core that actually has that skill or competency that's trying to transfer it out to the team. Whether it's like the code reviews and the style guide in your language or in your project, or whether it's like PagerDuty and production stuff and knowledge of the DevOps setup or whatever. It's the same story. You're gonna have some core that really knows it, and in the beginning, when you're rotating it, right, and this is clear, everybody has to accept this, you're purely paying an overhead. Because now I've got the one person who just came in from university. They have to do PagerDuty now. They're trying to debug something that they have a hard time to figure out. And of course, they're not going to be able to do it entirely on their own. And there's going to be other people that need to help them and stuff. So now you're actually like kind of paying double cost basically in a lot of cases. But this is the way to think about this is education, right? This is the team's tuition to have an insanely awesome team where everybody has really a shared sense of ownership and strong context about the overall system, how it's productionized, and so on. All right. This is just a simple example. I just want to show you guys exactly what I mean, because I really do mean making a spreadsheet, like I actually make these as spreadsheets. So just a couple of examples, where you're doing a code review, like I said, or another one for interviews. I forgot to change this after I did, I fixed it. So shadow and then lead a phone screen and then review the output. So if I'll let the person interview on their own, but then now I want to review their interview notes. And I'll keep on top of that for a month, and I'll just make sure they don't make any mediocre interview notes. And it's like, okay, this person's good, they know how to do this, I can trust their output, nobody needs to like watch over them anymore. And then after this, which I didn't put on here, eventually they get approved to be a trainer. That's like the ultimate one, right? And then they can also kind of help people get through the approval matrix. So this is how you build like a self-replicating team that can basically spread the context and skill set needed for all the core responsibilities. Okay. The release pipeline. So these are just I'm going to kind of go through. I'm not going to talk in a ton of detail, but I just want to give you guys the flavor of the types of stuff that I feel like needs to be very explicitly called out and put onto the wiki and managed under a detailed and precise like engineering system. So how do you do builds and build cops, like who's responsible when builds break, and how does that process work? What's the escalation paths? How does the build pipeline flow out into releases? Who are the release sheriffs who are kind of shepherding this? Again, I think this should rotate around the team and everybody should have to do it. Everybody should be able to cut a release. If you show me an engineering team that can do a weekly iteration and then cut it, and then everyone on the team can rotate the release every week, like that alone tells me a lot about the team, right? Like there's a lot of things that I can assume and know about that team because the team is doing that. It's so important. Like if you're not cutting releases and you don't know how to do it, you don't understand so much about what's even going on, really. Perf testing is very important because, again, like it's not just functional requirements, it's non-functional requirements, obviously. And you need to bake that stuff into the release pipeline, not sort of test it ad hoc or find out about a whole bunch of issues in prod. I think you really want to have performance benchmarks baked into your continuous release cycle and into the build. And I'm also a believer in multi-level perf benchmarking, and just like, you have unit tests, integration tests, system tests. I feel exactly the same way about perf testing. A lot of people will say some kinds of perf testing are useless and stuff, so just a quick word on this, like say for example micro benchmarking or whatever, there's always naive ways to do micro benchmarking that it gives you nonsense results, right? Always. But there's also ways where you can isolate useful micro benchmarks that serve as something like a unit level perf test that are actually great. And that way you lock something in so people can't fiddle around with some mission critical implementation, make it slower and then not know about it. And then again, it's all about the cost of debugging, right? So I want the cost of the debugging to be low. If I have some complex piece of code and I know if somebody fiddles with this implementation, it can make the whole system slow down, and I know it's core and it's just a super common path in the runtime, then I want to wrap it in one of these isolated micro benchmarks, because I don't want to have to go into this, find this thing in production and work through big complicated stack traces and fiddle around with stuff and try to figure out what's going on. I want to find it, in this kind of low level set. Okay. Sales and delivery. So there's sales engineering, which is sort of like all the pre-work for sales, like prototypes and building out of collateral, like marketing materials. Also visioning, like working with the product and the business people to do like kind of the art of the possible. I think when engineers start to exercise their muscles with this like outside world concept I'm talking about, many times people will start to realize that they could have a say in direction. I call this like the art of the possible. So the engineers realize that they can provide art of the possible, not just provide constraints. I think many engineers only think of themselves as providing constraints in building stuff, right? Here's what we're going to do, give me an estimation. That's not how it should work. Engineers that want to work on the kind of stuff that we do, or really I think in any product company, in my opinion, it should be more like, here's the problem, let's work together and figure out the ideal solution. And I want engineering there, I want product there, I want business there, I want sales there, I want everyone there. I want to figure out the optimal solution. You're not going to get a very good solution when you just have the PM thinking about it, right? And then they just tell the engineer, here's what we're going to do, and the engineer says, here's how long I think it's going to take, right? You're not going to get the best solution. Forward deployed engineer, we talked about that earlier, I'm not going to cover it. POCs in communications. So these things are very important. They should really be, again, made systematic. Should a playbook for POCs, like all the way down to the workshops that you do to kick it off, and the way that you present results after the POC and review that. It should all be very formulaic. And the communications is the same, all the way down to like SLAs. Like let's say the client, like if you're working on a sales deal and it's at like the final stage, what's the SLA on client communication? If the client writes to an engineer, how quickly should they have to reply? There should be like a rule, just like PagerDuty or anything else, like make systems for this stuff. Okay, quality. So I put this in here, it may not seem like a client-facing thing, but it kind of is, right? Because again, when you make your client your QA, it's very costly. And so doing this stuff right is very important, I think, for making this management of the client smoother. So I think architecture and design reviews are really important. Like at Google, they do design docs. I was talking about this earlier with Marianne up there, that we see like a design one-pager doc is like a really cool idea, because you don't want to get into analysis paralysis where you have these huge documents and they go for a very long time and there's huge flame wars in them and stuff. But it's also, you also don't want to see a totally new framework and a bunch of random stuff that shows up in a PR for the first time, right? And so you get this big PR and you're like, what is this, right? You never agreed to this. Like, why is this thing in here all of a sudden? So, and so there's need for some kind of upfront design and alignment among the team when you're doing bigger stuff. I like to just have it light, one pager, and one round of reviews, and then a final sign off. So basically you give the person who's driving the design doc the ultimate decision. So they have to take the feedback from the team in one round, but they don't have to keep discussing it with everyone. They don't have to get buy-in and alignment from everyone, doesn't have to agree with them. Somebody else can think that you should use a different framework. But in the end, there's a senior tech lead who has to sign off. And they're the one who owns making sure that the person doesn't do something really risky, and dumb that goes into production. And that like they're not being a jerk. Let's say the whole team does agree and they're doing something that's kind of a rogue move. You should probably stop them from damaging the team. But if it's like one of these situations where these two people want framework B, these two want framework A, and the guy that wants framework A is the one leading the design review, then let him do it, right? Unless it's really risky. If it's like marginal and it's kind of it doesn't matter that much, then I think it's more important to provide agency to people and not to waste time on huge amounts of analysis and trying to get everybody bought into the same solution. Style guide and code reviews, exactly the same thing, so I'm not going to talk about it. This is just like basically the same, but for code. Again, I think somebody should own the style guide and own the code review matrix and make sure that the code reviews are spread broadly among the team. And then test distribution. This is something that people oftentimes get wrong too, and it hurts bad with the customers because let's say, for example, when your test distribution is bad and you've got like the bulk of your coverage coming from some end-to-end system tests, then you find an issue in production and it takes like much longer to debug, basically because you don't have the kind of fine-grained decomposition probably that the code base needed to create unit tests, and you don't have like sort of a mindset around evaluating things at that level. So all you really have is some bug and very, very, very high-level tests. To fix the bug, people will tend to modify those end-to-end tests as well then, and not write like a new unit test around it. So it tends to create a longer cycle to triage and fix a production bug. So it will rear its head in these weird, counterintuitive ways that you might not understand. It's not just like kind of how long the build takes and these other very obvious things that the engineers feel every day, but there's many downstream negative effects on the client. Okay. So we talked about this. First line is the whole team. Second line is like the core team. The core team helps the first line to learn about it. And then the engineers start to learn to design for monitoring. They start to learn to think about production systems well. They start to think, oh man, I should decompose how I declare this computation that I want to do from the way that it's run. Because then I can configure it in a different way for a unit test that all runs in process in one thread. I can do it a different way for an integration test. I can then wrap this kind of function in some other higher order function that's observing the stuff going in and coming out and the characteristics as the function executes. So now I'm starting to think as an engineer about how to design my abstractions for my services and my top level functions in such a way that they integrate really nicely into a production systems and that they're monitored in a really nice and fine-grained way. So for example, we did with one of my last companies, we built this thing, which is still up on GitHub if anyone wants to check it out. It's called Graph. It's a closure library called Graph, and it's basically like a thing that will walk a DAG of functions and can apply other functions to them. And we used it for monitoring and configuring services and things like this. So you can basically just say, again, like here's like sort of the graph of functions and how I want it to run. And I'm not going to have logging crap all over the place and none of this crap, right? It's just going to be really clean code expressing what it's meant to do. I'm gonna tackle the monitoring on like a higher order way and come and wrap all those functions. And I'm going to monitor all those functions in a consistent way. And now I can libraryify my monitoring and I can add other different monitoring tools really easily. I can kind of plug them into this way. So you start to get the engineers to think completely differently when you force them to really deal with production stuff. And this is so, so important, I think. Okay. That might be it. Is that it? Awesome. Woohoo! All right, guys. How many questions? Let's do it. Anyone? No? You got it. It's a weird topic, hopefully, I don't know. What do you think? Was it a useful topic or no? Yeah? I see some headlines. What's that?
The real one thing that until they ask that
You have to ask at least one question.
Alright, I have one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you haven't mentioned is that do you use Scrum or?
This is a very good question. It's a sensitive one for me. So, I think Scrum is one of the worst things that ever happened in the history of tech, actually. It's really bad. And I'll tell you why. The reason why is that the basic, simple, agile process stuff is fine. Like the idea that you want to do like a weekly iteration and some planning meeting, and you should use some tracker and tickets, and you should like decompose the tickets and estimate them and stuff. I think kind of mostly people agree with this stuff. This is good. This is fine. Problem with Scrum is that that's all it is, and then it tries to pretend that it's doing organization design and management and stuff, and it's not. There's nothing else. It's just project management. And so that's how it ruins organizations, actually, is you have people that think they know what they're doing as a manager, but they actually are just a quote-unquote Scrum master. They basically can just do project management. And so my problem with Scrum is you take something which is basically like 1/2 of 1% of the overall pie of managing a software project, and then you try to pretend like that's the thing. That's just bullshit, right? So Scrum is like snake oil salesmanship of basic, simple, agile project management principles, and it should be viewed as such. And then all the other aspects of like this kind of stuff and people management processes and all this stuff, there's nothing about any of this in Scrum, right? It's we do use it for planning, definitely, like, but not Scrum. We just use Agile, I would say, right? We use basic Agile, like, and I think that's good. But I think it's super important for everybody to realize how many other things are involved in running an awesome product and engineering organization. Because people will tend to just keep messing around with dials on this agile process of stuff. And like, you just want to get a basic, good, simple scaffolding in place and move on, because there's so much more. So that's why Scrum would be really, really good. Anyone else? Sure. So I think the most important thing is you should really spend a lot of time on something that looks kind of like a pipeline process is all I'm going to call. And basically really think about what are the stages in your pursuit process, right? And really carefully think about those and define what qualifies something to move to the next stage. Be very thoughtful about that. You know, what does it mean that this thing just moved from like intro call to like team tech meeting, whatever you have as your different steps, right? And you know, it means that they answered yes to like 3 questions or whatever would happen exactly in that intro call, like that, which qualifies the need, like they have the need, they're going to spend money on it sometime soon, and this is the right stakeholder or something like that, right? So you have these different qualification criteria that are questions you need to answer at each step in the deal in order to move it to the next step, and then you want to adjust it as you go, as you learn, right? And you want to build that process. That process will then express itself in your pipeline management software. But it's a fun thing about the process and this qualification of the stages